The banquet hall smelled like gardenias and warm rolls that had been sitting out too long. My father was standing at the head table with the microphone in his right hand, still smiling at something he had just said, when I heard the chair scrape back hard across the floor. Everyone in the room turned. I turned. The man who stood up had known my father for 40 years. He looked at me once, across all those white tablecloths and centerpieces and candles nobody had lit yet, and then he looked at my father and he said, "Gary, sit down." The smile on my father's face didn't move. Not yet. But to understand what happened in that room, you need to know who I was before that night. My name is Dina Calvert. I was 34 years old the summer my brother got married. I was a squad boss on the Pike Hotshots, a Type 1 hotshot crew out of Pike National Forest in Colorado. If that doesn't mean anything to you, here is what it means. We were 20 of us who went where other crews came back from. We worked fires that the helicopters couldn't get low enough to reach and the bulldozers couldn't get close to. I had been doing the job for 11 years by then. In 2018, I helped hold a ridgeline outside Durango for 16 hours in 40-mile-an-hour winds while 3 other crews were pulled to safety behind us. I am not telling you that to impress you. I am telling you because it is the kind of thing that was in my professional record, that people in my field knew about me, and that my father described to his friends as, and I am quoting him exactly, quote 1, "I grew up in Pueblo, Colorado. My father Gary sold commercial insurance. My mother left when I was 9, and I don't have much to say about that. My brother Tyler is 3 years younger than me, and for most of our childhood we were close. The way kids get close when the house is a little empty. When you learn to make do with what's there and rely on each other for the small things. Cereal for dinner. Figuring out the cable box. That kind of close. The person who actually raised us was our grandmother. Everyone called her Nana Ruth. She lived 20 minutes away in a pale yellow house with a garden that took up most of the backyard and a pine tree in the corner that I had climbed as a child and that I still looked at sometimes when I visited, thinking about the kid I was when that tree seemed enormous. Nana Ruth was a retired postal carrier who kept her finances in a spiral notebook and her spare key under a ceramic frog by the back door. She called every Sunday evening at 7 without fail, asked about each fire I worked by name, and made the best green chile in Pueblo County. Which in Pueblo County is not a casual claim. Every time I walked into her backyard, I smelled pine resin and dry grass. It smelled like every good Sunday of my childhood. It smelled like the only place I knew where I was not being managed or explained or tolerated. It smelled like safety, and I know that is a simple thing to say. But it was a simple and true thing. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. That was the problem. Tyler had been with his girlfriend Amber for 4 years when he proposed to her in March of 2022. The wedding was set for the following August, outdoor ceremony and reception at a venue called the Ponderosa Lodge outside Colorado Springs. I got the save the date card while I was on pre-season training rotation in New Mexico. I texted Tyler back the same day. I will be there. I meant it. Whatever had grown complicated between us over the years, he was still my brother, and Amber was good for him, and I wanted to be at that wedding. Nana Ruth had been sick for about 18 months before Tyler proposed. Congestive heart failure, managed but progressing, the slow kind of illness that takes its time. By the fall of 2021, I could hear something different in her voice on Sunday calls. A tiredness underneath the words. Like she was speaking from further away than she used to. I brought it up with my father in November of that year. He said he had it handled. He said he had spoken with her bank and arranged some things so that her bills could be paid automatically if she became incapacitated. He said not to worry. He had taken her to 2 medical appointments without mentioning it to me until I asked directly. She had seemed quieter than usual, but when I asked her about it, she said she was just adjusting to a new medication. And I believed her because she said it in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. When I visited her in January of 2022, she had reorganized her kitchen and her living room, moved her things around in a way that struck me as deliberate and careful. She said she was getting things tidy. I thought it was an old woman's need for order. I didn't ask her what she meant by tidy for whom, or why now. I wish I had asked. She died in April. I was on standby rotation in Montana when my father called. I drove 9 hours straight and arrived at her house the morning after she died. My father was already there, sitting at her kitchen table with her papers spread in front of him and a yellow legal pad propped against the sugar bowl. He looked up when I came through the door and said, quote, _2. I sat in Nana Ruth's living room in the chair where she used to read, and I listened to the pine tree moving in the backyard, and I let myself feel what I needed to feel. Then I went back on rotation because there were fires, and because working was the only thing I had that I was certain of. The will reading was in May. The probate attorney read it in his office on a Wednesday morning, the house, the savings, and all personal property to be divided equally between me and Tyler, with my father serving as executor. The estate was valued at roughly $240,000, most of it in the house. My father said everything was moving through probate normally. He said I could relax. I found out later that while I was driving home from that appointment, my father was already on the phone with a real estate attorney he knew from his insurance work. Not the probate attorney, a different one. The house sold in late June. I found out because I drove past it on a visit home, and there was a sold sign in the yard and a dumpster in the driveway, and strangers inside with measuring tape. Nobody had called me. I pulled into a gas station on Bonfort Boulevard and called my father from the parking lot. He said it was a seller's market. He said the offer had come in fast and he'd had to move quickly. He said the proceeds were in the estate account and everything was fine, and he would send me the paperwork. He used the word paperwork the way certain people use the word soon, as a promise that exists only as long as the other person keeps believing in it. I called Tyler that night. He said Dad had it handled. He said, "You know how he is. He's thorough." I remember the specific flatness in his voice when he said that word, thorough, like he had rehearsed it. 2 weeks passed, no paperwork. I called the probate attorney's office directly, and the paralegal told me all beneficiary inquiries needed to go through the executor. I asked her to confirm that I was a named beneficiary and therefore had a right to status updates. She put me on hold for 4 minutes and came back and said the executor had formally requested that all contact go through him. I wrote that sentence down in a notebook. I was starting a notebook. It was the 14th of July, 2022. A Thursday afternoon, and I was in the break room at our crew station in Colorado Springs when a card arrived. Plain white envelope. My name on the front in Nana Ruth's handwriting. She had mailed it in late March, 3 weeks before she died, and it had been forwarded twice before it reached me. My hands went cold when I opened it. Not from the air conditioning in that room, just cold, from somewhere inside, all at once. It was a birthday card, the kind she always sent, illustrated flowers on the cover. But inside she had written 2 pages in her small, careful script. The kind of handwriting you only learn in a certain era of school. She said she had been worrying about something and needed me to know it before she was gone. She said my father had been very helpful through her illness, but that on 2 occasions he had brought her papers to sign that she didn't fully understand, and both times when she asked him to explain them he said they were just estate planning. Ruth, nothing to worry about. She said she had trusted him and signed. She said she went to her bank the week before she wrote the letter and asked the teller about one of her accounts. And the teller told her the account had been changed to a transfer on death designation in January, naming my father as the sole beneficiary. Not me, not Tyler, my father alone. She wrote, quote, for. I read it twice. Then I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I had received a letter from Nana Ruth. There was a pause, about 3 seconds long, which is longer than a pause needs to be unless someone is recalculating something on the other end of the line. He said, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 5, underscore, underscore. I asked him about the transfer on death designation on her bank account. He said that was a standard estate planning tool and that I was misunderstanding how probate worked. He said it was a small household account. He said everything would be distributed fairly. He said I sounded stressed and that Tyler's wedding was coming up, and maybe we should focus on that and let him do his job. I asked him one direct question: what is the current balance of Nana Ruth's estate? He said he would have to look that up. He never did. I called the probate attorney's office the next morning, and I had retained my own legal counsel by the end of that week. And that is when I found out the second thing. The thing underneath the first thing. The transfer on death account had contained $112,000, not a small household fund. $112,000, accumulated over 40 years by a woman who had carried mail in Colorado winters, and my father had redirected every cent of it to himself 8 weeks before she died. He had done it legally, using a designation she had signed without understanding what she was signing, and he had done it before the probate even opened, which meant it had never entered the estate at all. It was just gone, and Tyler had known. Not everything. But he had been there the afternoon my father drove Nana Ruth to the bank to sign the account paperwork. He had been sitting in the lobby of that branch, waiting for them. When I had asked him once, offhandedly, where he was that week, he had told me he was in Denver for a work thing. He had looked me in the eye when he said it. They had no idea what they had just done, and I was going to let them keep not knowing. For a while. Now I want to be clear about something. When I retained my attorney, I had one handwritten letter, one suspicious phone call, and a bank account designation that my father could almost certainly describe as a simple estate planning choice that his grieving mother-in-law had agreed to voluntarily. I had no plan beyond the next 72 hours. I was 2 weeks from starting a new fire season. But 11 years of working wildland fire teaches you something that has nothing to do with flames. It teaches you that the first thing you do in a bad situation is stop. Stop moving. Get still. Look at what is actually in front of you. Not what you're afraid of. Not what you've already decided is true. What is actually there. And what was actually in front of me, once I got quiet enough to see it, was the beginning of a paper trail that my father had assumed no one would ever follow, because he had spent 34 years assuming I was the kind of person who didn't notice things, or who noticed and said nothing. He was about to find out how wrong that assumption was. He just didn't know it yet. My attorney was a woman named Constance Brierly. She had been practicing estate law in Colorado Springs for 26 years, and the first thing she told me when I sat down across from her desk was that what I was describing, if it was accurate, was not unusual. She said that in her experience, contested estates almost always involved a trusted family member, a vulnerable elder, and documents signed in the last 12 to 18 months of a life. She said the law was not always on the right side of those situations, and that I should hear that clearly before we went further. She was in her late 50s, kept her office very cold, and spoke in the clipped, precise way of someone who had learned not to waste words on things she couldn't prove. I liked her immediately. She told me what I needed. 1. Evidence that Nana Ruth had not understood what she signed. 2. Evidence of a pattern, not just one incident. 3. The actual documents, which as a beneficiary of the probate estate, I had a legal right to request. She told me to request them formally, in writing, through the probate court, so that my father could not later claim I had simply asked, and he had declined. She told me to document every conversation I had with my father from this point forward. She said, quote, 6. I had been writing in notebooks since I was in fire school. I knew how to document. She also told me to get someone from Nana Ruth's bank. Not to confront anyone, not to make allegations, just to speak to someone who had processed the account change and ask whether standard protocols had been followed, whether a third party had been present, whether there was any notation in the account file. She said banks keep internal records that never make it into official paperwork, and that sometimes those records are the most useful thing in the room. I filed the formal document request on a Monday. My father called me that Friday. His voice was even and slightly careful, the way it got when he was managing something. He said he had heard I had retained counsel. I said that was correct. He said he thought that was an overreaction and that I was making things difficult for Tyler right before his wedding. I said I was a beneficiary of my grandmother's estate, and I was exercising my legal right to access estate documents. He said, quote 7, I wrote that sentence down. The time was 4:52 in the afternoon. I was sitting in my truck in the cruise station parking lot. The light was that particular flat gold that comes in late July in Colorado, the kind that makes everything look slightly too still. The documents arrived from the probate court 12 days later. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and went through them the same way I go through incident command briefings, slowly, with a highlighter, noting every number and date. The estate as declared in probate showed the house sale, the household goods, and one savings account. Total declared value, $118,000. My share as declared, $59,000, pending probate close. No mention of the bank account Nana Ruth had described. No mention of the transfer on death designation. No mention of any funds totaling $112,000, because that money was not in the estate. It had never been filed as part of the estate. It had transferred directly to my father the week after Nana Ruth died, and it was gone. That was when I pulled the county records, the publicly available ones, the kind anyone can access from a courthouse terminal. And I saw the date the transfer on death beneficiary change had been recorded. January 9th, 2022. 3 weeks after my father had told me he had spoken with Nana Ruth's bank and arranged some things. 3 weeks after he had used the words arrange some things on a phone call in November, while I was nodding and saying, okay, and trusting him because he was my father and she was his mother-in-law, and I had no reason to think anything else was happening. I had to sit down. I was already sitting down, but I sat back in my chair the way you do when something lands in your chest and takes up space. He had done it 6 months before she died. Not in her final weeks when she might have been less capable. He had done it in January, while she was still relatively lucid, which meant he had done it carefully and deliberately, and early enough that no one could claim it was a deathbed decision. I called Constance the next morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Get me the bank records and find out who was with her." The unexpected person was a woman named Dolores Reyes. She had worked as a teller at that branch for 14 years and had processed the account change on January 9th. I found her because the branch manager, when I went in person and asked to speak with someone about a deceased customer's account, was uncomfortable and kept saying he would need to consult with their legal department. But Dolores was standing 3 feet away, and she looked at me for a long moment and then said quietly, quote, 9, quote. She met me for coffee the following Saturday morning. Her choice. A place on the south side of the city she clearly knew well. She told me she had been bothered by that appointment since the day it happened. She said Nana Ruth had been pleasant and seemed engaged, but had asked twice what the form was for, and both times my father had answered for her, saying it was estate planning, just the last few things to get sorted. She said she had asked my grandmother directly, as was her training, whether she understood the change she was making to her account. And my grandmother had looked at my father and then looked back at her and said, quote, 10. Dolores had flagged the interaction in the account notes. She had written, quote, 11. That note was still in the file. 14 months later. It was still in the file. Dolores said she had 2 daughters. She said she hoped someone would do the same for her someday if it came to it. She paid for her own coffee and left. I want to pause here for a second. Because at this point, I had the letter. I had the date. I had the bank notation. I had a paper trail that ran from November of 2021 straight through to a probate estate that was missing $112,000. I had Constance, who had stopped speaking in caveats 2 weeks prior and had started speaking in calendar dates. And I remember sitting across from her the week before Tyler's wedding, and she said to me, and I'm going to quote her exactly, quote, 12. And I understood exactly what she meant. I had been in situations before where the person across from me had more resources and more noise and more certainty. Fire doesn't care about your certainty. It responds to what is actually there. I had been waiting for the room where what was actually there was finally going to matter. I had one meeting left. I had everything I needed. But I hadn't told them that yet. The meeting was scheduled for the Monday after Tyler's wedding. That had been my father's suggestion, actually. He had called 2 weeks prior, calm and conciliatory, his attorney speaking in the background, and said, "Could we get everyone together the week after the wedding, clear the air, figure out the estate distribution?" His attorney had used the phrase, Constance had used the phrase, I had agreed to the meeting and said nothing else. But first there was the wedding. The ceremony itself was fine. Outdoor, late afternoon, the kind of golden light that makes everyone look like they are standing inside a memory. I wore a blue dress I had bought in Colorado Springs, and I stood in the third row and I watched my brother marry a woman who seemed genuinely good, and I felt the complexity of that, loving someone and knowing what you know about them, holding those two things at the same time. I have done harder things. The reception was at the Ponderosa Lodge, a converted barn with string lights and round tables, and a bartender named Marcus who made very good gin and tonics, and who I will remember fondly for the rest of my life. I was seated at table 6. My father was at the head table. My father had been toasting things all evening. His son's health was good at it. He had a certain ease and was good at it. He had a certain ease in front of people that I had watched him deploy my entire life, a warm expansiveness that made people feel included, made them lean in. It was, in its way, a skill. I had spent 11 years learning to respect skills even when I hated the person who had them. He picked up the microphone for the last toast at 9:45 in the evening. He talked about Tyler, he talked about Amber, he talked about family and tradition and roots, and then he looked at me at table 6, in my blue dress with my gin and tonic, and he said, quote, 15. He smiled when he said it. The kind of smile that is doing two things at once. Performing warmth for the room and delivering something else entirely to the person it is aimed at. The room laughed a little, politely, the way rooms do when they are not sure what they just heard. And then I heard the chair scrape back. Roy Chambers had known my father since they were both 23 years old. They had been in the same insurance firm for 15 years. He had been at my parents' wedding. He had been at Nana Ruth's funeral, in the second row, and he had held my hand in the parking lot afterward and said she was a remarkable woman. He was 67 years old, and he was not a man who made scenes. He stood up and he said, quote, 17. The room went very quiet. Roy was not finished. Quote, 18, he said. Quote, 19, he paused, and he looked at me. Quote, underscore 20. He sat down. Nobody moved for a long moment. Marcus the bartender set a glass down very carefully and quietly on the bar. I had been thinking about what I was going to say in that Monday meeting for 11 weeks. I knew exactly when to say it. We pulled into the parking garage at 8:47 in the morning. I remember checking the time. Constance's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Tejon Street that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. The conference room they had reserved for the meeting had a long table, 8 chairs, a window that looked out onto the street below, and a clock on the wall that made a faint tick every second that you could only hear when the room was quiet. It was quiet a lot that morning. I was wearing my good wool blazer, the gray one I had bought for Nana Ruth's funeral and had not worn since. That choice was deliberate. My father had not been at enough fires to know what it means when someone shows up dressed for the occasion they are actually attending, rather than the one you told them to expect. My father and his attorney arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. His attorney was a man named Preston, mid-40s, good suit, the kind of practiced pleasantness that lawyers use the way a hand uses a glove. My father shook Constance's hand and then looked at me and nodded, the nod of a man who has already decided how this ends. He set his briefcase down, settled into the chair across from mine, and took out a yellow legal pad. His own. He clicked his pen twice. Small performance of readiness. I put my folder on the table in front of me and left it closed. Preston opened by saying they were prepared to discuss an expedited resolution that recognized my contribution to the family and allowed the estate to close cleanly and without further delay. He said expedited resolution. He said my contribution to the family. He slid a single sheet across the table. A settlement offer, $41,000, less than my declared half of the declared estate, to be paid upon signing a full release of all claims. My father watched my face while I read it. Constance said we would take note of the offer. Preston then spent about 10 minutes explaining, in careful procedural language, why the transfer on death account was entirely outside the scope of the probate estate, why it represented a legitimate and documented estate planning decision made by a competent adult, and why any challenge to it would be expensive, time-consuming. At me with the expression of a man waiting for a bus. He was good at his job. My father said nothing during this. He held his pen and looked at the table, and then occasionally at me with the expression of a man waiting for something he has already been promised. I let Preston finish. Then I opened the folder and placed the first document on the table and pushed it toward the center. It was the bank account notation. 14 months old. Typed by Dolores Reyes into an internal file she had never expected anyone to retrieve. Customer deferred to accompanying family member for explanation of account change. Customer appeared uncertain. Preston looked at it. His face did not change immediately. He read it once. He read it again. He turned it slightly, as if the angle mattered. Then I placed the second document, the January 9th recording date from the county, time-stamped against my father's November phone call, in which he had told me he had arranged some things, a call I had reconstructed from my own notes and from a text message I had sent to a colleague that same evening referencing the conversation, time-stamped at 6:14 in the evening of November 23rd, 2021. Then I placed the letter. Nana Ruth's handwriting, 2 pages, small and careful and entirely legible. I had a certified copy made. I placed the original beside it. 2 copies of the same document is not necessary unless you want the room to understand that you have been thorough. I wanted the room to understand that I had been thorough. My father looked at the letter. He looked at it the way you look at something you thought you had accounted for and had not. Preston put his pen down. Constance said, quote, 21. The clock on the wall ticked. My father said, quote, 22. His voice was different. Not smaller exactly, more careful. The warmth he used in rooms with microphones had gone somewhere. Quote 23. I had been waiting 11 weeks to say one sentence. I said it quietly. The way you say things you have thought about long enough that they no longer need volume. Underscore. Underscore. Quote. Underscore 24. Underscore. Underscore. Preston asked for a 10-minute recess. My father stood up and went to stand by the window. He looked out at Tejon Street below, at whatever was moving down there. Cars and people, an ordinary Monday morning. His hands were in his pockets. His shoulders were doing something I had not seen them do before. Something that was not quite the shape I had always known them to be. Constance looked at me across the table. She said nothing. She did not need to. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When Preston came back, He said his client was prepared to discuss a revised resolution. The final agreement, signed 6 weeks later, recovered $83,000 of the transferred funds, returned to the estate, and distributed according to the original will. My father retained the remainder. He did not face criminal charges. Constance had explained to me, in her careful, cold office voice, that proving elder financial abuse beyond a civil standard was a different matter, and that the bank notation and the letter were powerful in mediation and less certain in a courtroom, and that $83,000 recovered was not nothing. She was right, it was not nothing. I signed the agreement, and I did not gloat and I did not cry, and I took the elevator down to the parking garage alone. I stood next to my truck for about a minute. I put my hand on the hood, the warm metal, the solid, ordinary weight of it. Then I got in and drove to a diner on 8th Street and ordered eggs and coffee and sat by the window and watched the street. Constance called me that afternoon. She said, quote, 25, quote. For her, that was a speech. Tyler called me 3 weeks after the agreement was signed. He said he wanted me to know he hadn't understood the full picture. He said our father had told him the account transfer was something Nana Ruth had specifically requested. He said he should have asked more questions. There was a long pause after that, the kind that is full of things neither person is going to say. I told him I heard him. I did not tell him I believed him entirely, because I was not certain I did, and I had made a decision somewhere in the past 4 months to stop saying things I could not fully document. We have spoken twice since then. It is not nothing, and it is not what it was, and I do not know yet what it will become. That is the most honest thing I can say about it. Roy Chambers sent me a card 2 weeks after the wedding. Plain envelope. Inside he had written, Ruth would have been glad someone was paying attention. I keep it in the glove box of my truck, still there. There was a child's bicycle in the driveway, and a new garden, starting in the back where her old one had been, just the first plantings, small and deliberate and not yet what they were going to be. I drove past and I kept going. That was 2 years ago now. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Woodland Park, 40 minutes from the crew station. I have a kitchen table I bought secondhand, and a porch where I drink coffee in the mornings before my shift when the light is coming up over the mountains and the air is cold enough to mean something. I am a crew supervisor now. I have 7 people under my direct responsibility on the line, and I know their names and their skill sets and their particular ways of moving through difficult terrain, and I take that seriously every single day. My father sold his insurance firm in the spring. I heard this through a cousin, not from him. He and I have not spoken since the morning in Constance's conference room, when he stood at that window with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders in that unfamiliar shape. I do not know what we are to each other now. I am not sure there is a word for it yet. What I kept from all of it is this. A woman I loved, who had carried mail through Colorado winters for 30 years and grown tomatoes in a small backyard and called every Sunday at 7 without fail, tried to protect me from beyond her own life. She put it in a birthday card with illustrated flowers on the cover, and she mailed it to a forwarding address she had written down carefully, not certain it would reach me. Not certain of anything except that she needed to try. That is what I think about when I want to understand what loyalty actually looks like. Not the large gestures, not the rooms with microphones, the careful handwriting, the ceramic frog by the back door, the trying anyway. There is one more thing I haven't told you yet. When I moved into the Woodland Park house, I planted a pine tree in the backyard. Small thing, maybe 3 feet tall, wrapped in burlap when I brought it home. I put it in the corner. I don't know exactly why I put it in the corner. I just knew that was where it belonged. If you've been through something like this, I would genuinely want to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to hear what happened the first time I saw my father after the agreement was signed, that story is coming next.